In the heart of the Dakota Territory, a place carved by wind and sorrow, a lone lantern burned against an ocean of black. This was the home of Alex Finch, a widow. Her whole world was this patch of stubborn soil and the small, beating heart of her 7-year-old son, Samuel. The year was 1876, a time of blood and dust. And on a night when the sky itself was at war, a sound came that would shatter her world. It wasn't a coyote, it wasn't the storm. It was a knock on her door, a knock that promised either salvation or a shallow grave. What stood on her doorstep was her greatest fear, a dying man, an enemy. She had no idea that by letting him in, she wasn't just saving a life, she was forging a legend. The wind was a living thing that night. It clawed at the sod roof of the small cabin, a mournful beast trying to peel back the earth and expose the meager life huddled inside. Alex, a woman who looked far older than her 28 years, sat by the hearth. The firelight threw dancing shadows across the lines of worry etched deep around her eyes. Her husband Thomas had been gone a year, taken by the lung fever. He was a good, quiet man who poured his life into this small plot of land by Whispering Creek, a place most folks considered cursed. Now all that was left of his dream was Alex, Samuel, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight on her chest. That's when the knock came. Not a timid rap. It was a heavy, desperate thud, almost lost in the gale. Alex froze. Her hand clutched the worn handle of a sewing needle. No one came out this far. Not in this weather. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride. Her closest neighbors were miles of hostile prairie away. Her mind went to the darkest places. Bandits, or worse, Clay Rock, the foreman from Silas Kane's sprawling cattle empire, coming to deliver another one of his veiled threats about her water rights. She reached for the heavy shotgun Thomas had kept propped by the door, her hands trembling as she lifted its cold weight. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice a thin thread against the storm's roar. A groan was the only answer, a sound of pure agony, almost swallowed by the wind. It was a human sound. Against every instinct that screamed at her to stay hidden, she crept toward the door. Peeking through a small crack in the weathered planks, she saw a shape slumped against the frame. A flash of lightning bleached the landscape white, burning the image into her mind. It was a man, an Indian. His long black hair was matted with mud and what looked like blood. He wore the buckskin leggings and breechcloth of a warrior, but his body was a wreck. One leg was bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. A dark stain was spreading from a crude bandage on his thigh. He was Lakota. She knew the markings, the style of his moccasins. He was the enemy, the boogeyman from the tales whispered in Redemption, the savage that men like Sheriff Brody warned her about. Her blood ran cold. The Battle of the Little Bighorn had happened only a few months prior. The territory was a tinderbox of fear and hatred. Harboring this man would be a death sentence. They'd call her a traitor, a sympathizer. Silas Kane would finally have the excuse he needed to burn her out for good. The man slid down the door, leaving a smear of blood, and collapsed onto the porch with a soft thud. He was either unconscious or dying. Alex's heart hammered against her ribs. This was a test. The world outside this door was cruel. It would punish any weakness. But the world inside, the one she'd built with Thomas, was based on something else. She looked at Samuel sleeping peacefully, his face a picture of innocence. What kind of world was she raising him in if she let a man, any man, die on her doorstep? Thomas, a devout man despite the harshness of his life, had always said, "Mercy ain't a choice, Alex. It's a debt we owe to God for our own breath." Cursing herself, her fear, and the God who had sent this trial to her door, she unbarred it. The wind blasted in, extinguishing the lantern and plunging the room into near darkness. With a strength born of desperation, she grabbed the warrior under his arms and dragged his dead weight inside. The scent of rain, blood, and prairie soil filled her small home. She managed to heave him onto the bearskin rug before the hearth, his broken body stark against the flickering firelight. He was younger than she first thought, his face sharp and proud even in unconsciousness. A deep, jagged gash ran along his jawline, a fresh wound. But the leg was the real problem. A bullet by the looks of it. The flesh around the wound was swollen and hot to the touch. She was no doctor, but she was a homesteader. She knew how to set a chicken's wing, stitch a hog, and tend a wound. Working quickly, she lit another lantern and boiled water. She cut away the filthy buckskin, her hands clinical and detached, trying not to think about who this man was or what he might have done. The wound was horrific. The bullet had shattered the bone in his upper thigh. Infection had already set in, the red streaks crawling up his skin like poisonous vines. For hours she worked. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, her last precious bottle, ignoring his delirious moans. She used pliers sterilized in the fire to probe for the lead ball, her stomach churning at the gruesome task. Finally, she found it, a flattened piece of lead she dropped into a tin bowl with a sickening clink. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and willow bark, her grandmother's remedies, and splinted the leg as best she could with 2 pieces of firewood and strips torn from her own bedsheets. As dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving a washed, clean world behind. The Lakota warrior was alive, his breathing shallow but steady. He was burning with fever. Alex collapsed into her chair, the shotgun resting on her lap, her body aching with exhaustion. She had just invited the devil into her home. She had saved his life, and in doing so, had likely condemned her own. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest and whispered into the quiet room, "God help us all." The days that followed were a tightrope walk over a canyon of fear. The Lakota warrior, whose name she did not know, drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. In his delirium, he spoke in a language that was to Alex like the whispering of the plains wind, full of cadence and emotion, but utterly incomprehensible. He would cry out names, his hands clenching, his body straining against the splint. In these moments, Alex saw not a savage beast, but a man haunted by ghosts. Samuel was terrified at first. He would hide behind his mother's skirts, peering out at the stranger who had taken over their hearth. "Is he a bad man, Mama?" he asked, his small voice trembling. "He's a hurt man, Samuel," Alex answered, her voice more confident than she felt. "And we don't leave hurt people to die." She taught Samuel to help, to bring her clean rags and bowls of cool water from the creek. Slowly, the boy's fear turned to a hesitant curiosity. He would watch as Alex patiently spoon-fed the man thin broth or gently bathed his feverish brow. He saw his mother's compassion, and it became his own. On the third day, a new sound came from outside. Hoofbeats. Not the heavy tread of Cain's men, but something lighter. Alex's blood ran cold. She threw a thick blanket over the unconscious warrior, grabbed the shotgun, and peered through the crack in the door. It was Martha Miller, her nearest neighbor, holding a basket. Martha was a kind woman, but she was a gossip, and her husband was known to drink with clay rock. "Alex, dear," Martha called out. "Saw your light on all through the storm. Just wanted to make sure you and the boy were all right." Alex opened the door just enough to slip outside, closing it firmly behind her. "We're fine, Martha. Just a leaky roof. Kept me busy." Martha's eyes scanned the cabin. "Smells medicinal in there. Samuel not coming down with something, is he?" "Just some herbs I was boiling," Alex lied, her heart pounding, to clear the air. They spoke for a few more minutes, the polite conversation feeling like a lifetime. Just as Martha was about to leave, a low moan came from inside the cabin. A sound of pain. Martha's eyes narrowed. "What was that?" "The wind," Alex said quickly. "It gets in the chimney. Makes a terrible sound." Martha looked unconvinced but finally nodded, handed Alex the basket of bread, and rode off. Alex leaned against the door, her knees weak. It had been too close. The secret was already a fragile thing, and the world was pressing in. The next day, the fever broke. Alex was changing the dressing on his leg when his eyes fluttered open. They weren't the delirious, unfocused eyes of before. They were dark, sharp, and intelligent, and they were filled with a raw, caged hostility. He stared at her, then at his splinted leg, then at the unfamiliar cabin around him. He tried to sit up, a guttural cry of pain escaping his lips as his body betrayed him. "Easy," Alex said softly, holding up her hands to show she meant no harm. "You've been hurt bad. You need to rest." He didn't understand her words, but he understood the tone. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for deceit. He was a cornered wolf, ready to fight to the death despite his injuries. Alex backed away slowly, giving him space. She pointed to the bowl of broth on the small table. "Food," she said simply. Then she pointed to herself. "Alex." She pointed to her son, who was watching from the doorway. "Samuel." The warrior remained silent, his jaw tight. His gaze was a physical force, weighing and judging her. For 2 days they existed in this charged silence. He refused to let her near him again, so she left food and water where he could reach it. He would only eat when she and Samuel were on the other side of the room, his eyes never leaving them. It was a standoff, a war of wills fought in a 10 by 10-foot cabin. Then he did something that terrified her. While she was outside chopping wood, he managed to pull himself to the door, using the wall for support. He was trying to escape. He collapsed in the doorway, his leg twisting, a fresh wave of agony on his face. He wasn't just hostile, he was desperate. He would rather die in the wilderness than stay with her. The breakthrough came from Samuel. The boy had been watching the warrior for hours. Finally mustering his courage, he walked over and set a small, crudely carved wooden horse on the floor just beyond the man's reach. It was a toy his father had made for him. The Lakota man's eyes flickered down to the horse, then back to Samuel's earnest face. The boy offered a small, shy smile and retreated to his mother's side. For a long time, the warrior just stared at the toy. Then, with great effort, he reached out a trembling hand and picked it up. He turned it over and over in his fingers, tracing the simple lines. A flicker of something, sadness memory crossed his face. He looked at Alex, then at Samuel. His voice was rough from disuse. "Chayton," he said, tapping his own chest. "Falcon." It was the first stone laid in the foundation of a bridge. From then on, the tension lessened. Chayton, as she now knew him, began to communicate with gestures and single words. He learned water, fire, pain. She learned a few Lakota words for sun, moon, thank you. He watched everything. He watched how she mended Samuel's clothes, how she kneaded dough, how she aimed the shotgun at a rabbit from the doorway, bringing it down with a clean shot. A look of grudging respect entered his eyes. One afternoon, a week later, the sound of hoofbeats sent a jolt of panic through Alex. This time, it was the sound she dreaded. She quickly threw a blanket over the sleeping Chayton and motioned for Samuel to be quiet. Peeking out the window, her heart sank. It was Clay Rock and another one of Cain's men. Rock, a tall, swaggering man with a cruel twist to his lips and pale, dead eyes, dismounted and strode onto her porch as if he owned it. "Afternoon, Widow Finch," he said, his voice a lazy drawl that grated on her nerves. He tipped his hat, but it was a gesture of mockery, not respect. "Mr. Cain was just wondering how you were faring out here all alone. Wondering if you've reconsidered his generous offer for this dusty patch of land." "The land's not for sale, Mr. Rock. It was my husband's," Alex said, keeping her voice steady, the shotgun held loosely at her side. Rock's eyes swept over her property, lingering on the creek. "Water's getting scarce. A creek like this. It's a valuable thing. Too valuable for a woman and a boy to protect." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Smells different in here. You cooking something new?" Alex's blood ran cold. She could smell the faint, herby scent of the poultice she used on Chayton's leg. "Just some rabbit stew," she lied, her hand tightening on the gun. Rock smirked, unconvinced. He pushed past her, into the cabin. His eyes scanned the small room, lingering on the bearskin rug where Chayton was hidden under a pile of blankets, perfectly still. Rock kicked at the edge of the pile. Alex raised the shotgun. "Get out of my house!" Rock laughed. "Feisty." He looked at her, then back at the lump on the floor. "You hear about the army patrol that got ambushed up on the Red Shale Bluffs a few weeks ago? All dead. They only found 6 Lakota bodies. Rumor is at least one of them got away, wounded." He stared hard at her, letting the words hang in the air. "You see any wounded strays, you let the sheriff know. There's a bounty." He and his man finally rode off, but the threat lingered like poison in the air. When they were gone, Alex leaned against the door, her legs weak. She looked over at Chayton. He was awake, the blanket pushed aside. He had heard everything. His dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw a new understanding. They were no longer just a woman and a wounded man. They were allies, bound together by a shared and deadly secret. 2 weeks after Rock's visit, Alex's supplies were dangerously low. The flour sack was nearly empty, and she was down to her last few beans. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. The thought filled her with a cold dread. Leaving Chayton alone was a risk, but going to town meant facing the suspicion that now festered there. Chayton was getting stronger. With the help of a crude crutch he'd fashioned from a sturdy branch, he could now limp around the small cabin. His leg would never be the same. The bone had set crookedly, but his warrior spirit was returning. He was keenly aware of her predicament. Using a piece of charcoal on a slab of wood, he drew a map of the area around her homestead. He drew the creek, her cabin, and then a series of hills to the north. He pointed to a specific spot, a small cave hidden in a rocky outcrop. He then pointed to himself, then the cave. He would hide there while she was gone. If Rock returned, the cabin would be empty. The plan was sound, but it felt like a betrayal. She was forcing the man she had saved back out into the wilderness. He saw the hesitation in her eyes. He placed a hand on his chest, then pointed to her and Samuel. It was a gesture of protection, of shared fate. He was a partner in their survival. The ride to redemption was tense. The town seemed louder, more hostile than she remembered. Men watched her from the saloon porch, their gazes lingering. Women gathered outside the general store stopped their conversations and turned to stare, their whispers following her like biting flies. Inside the store, the proprietor, Mr. Abernathy, weighed her flour with a deliberate slowness. "Heard you had another visit from Clay Rock," he said, not meeting her eye. "Mr. Kane is persistent," Alex replied evenly. "He's more than persistent, Mrs. Finch," a voice behind her said. It was Sheriff Brodie. He seemed perpetually weary. His shoulders slumped under the weight of a badge he was too weak to carry effectively. "Silas Kane owns most of the folks in this town. He wants your land." "It's not for sale," she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "People are talking," Brodie went on, lowering his voice, "saying it's unnatural for a woman to be out there alone. After that business at the Red Shale Bluffs, folks are jumpy. They see shadows behind every rock." He looked at her directly, his gaze heavy with insinuation. "You make sure you ain't giving any of those shadows a place to hide. You hear me? For your own good, and the boys." The thinly veiled threat was clear. The entire town was an extension of Kane's will. She paid for her supplies, her hands trembling slightly. As she was leaving, a woman from church, Mrs. Gable, stopped her. "Alex, dear," the woman said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We've all been so worried. Perhaps you should consider selling to Mr. Kane. He could find you a nice, safe little room here in town." "I am safer on my own land than I would be in a town full of vultures," Alex snapped, her patience finally breaking. The woman recoiled as if struck. Alex immediately regretted her tone, but not the sentiment. She loaded her supplies and rode out of redemption without a backward glance, the weight of the town's collective judgment heavy on her shoulders. When she returned to the homestead at dusk, a profound sense of relief washed over her. It was her sanctuary. She found Chayton not in the cave, but near the creek, waiting. He had not been idle. In her absence, he had crafted a series of simple but ingenious snares, and 3 rabbits were hanging from a branch already skinned. He had also sharpened a long, thick branch into a formidable spear, its tip fire-hardened. He looked at her face and knew the trip had been difficult. He didn't need words to understand the story of the stares and whispers. That evening, as they ate the rabbit stew, a new dynamic settled between them. The town had cast her out. Rock and Kane were an ever-present threat. The world had shrunk to the 3 of them against everyone else. Later, as Samuel slept, Chayton took the small wooden horse the boy had given him. Using his knife, he began to carve. Alex watched him, the firelight playing over the intense concentration on his face. His hands, though strong and scarred, moved with an artist's grace. He wasn't carving another horse. He was carving a falcon, its wings outstretched, its eyes sharp and fierce. He was reclaiming a piece of himself, not just as a wounded warrior, but as Chayton. As she watched him, Alex realized her fear was changing. It was no longer the terror of the unknown man in her home. It was the fear of losing this strange, silent alliance that had become her only shield against the world. But she also noticed something else. While he carved, he would occasionally stop and listen, his head cocked toward the hills. He was hearing things she couldn't. He was sensing a change in the land. The danger wasn't just in town. It was getting closer. The weeks bled into a month, and the harsh Dakota autumn began its slow surrender to winter. The routine of the homestead became a shared rhythm. Alex managed the cabin and the garden. Shaitan, now moving with a grim determination on his crutch, became the silent guardian of their perimeter. He transformed his crutch into a tool, a weapon. He reinforced it with strips of rawhide and showed Samuel how it could be used to trip a running man or block a blow. His past remained a closed book, spoken only in the sad, distant look that would sometimes enter his eyes as he stared out at the setting sun. But one evening, as a cold front moved in, he decided to speak. He gestured for Alex and Samuel to sit by the fire. He took a piece of charcoal and began to draw on the smooth, flat stone of the hearth. His drawings were stark and vivid. He drew a circle of teepees, a village. He drew a woman with long braids and a small boy no older than Samuel, his wife, his son. Then he drew warriors on horseback. He drew himself among them, proud and strong, a falcon feather in his hair. He drew an ambush, the sudden flash of rifles from a rocky ridge. He depicted the chaos, the falling horses, the desperate fight. He drew the blue coats of the cavalry. He showed himself being shot, falling from his horse, his legs shattering. He drew himself crawling into the bushes, watching as his friends, his brothers, were cut down. He was the only one who escaped, dragging his broken body across the plains for days, following the faint silver line of Whispering Creek until he collapsed on her doorstep. He looked at Alex, his eyes hollow with the ghosts of his memory. "All gone," he whispered, the English words stark and brittle. He touched his chest. "Chayton is gone. Only this is left." He gestured to his crippled leg. Alex's heart ached for him. She saw past the Lakota warrior, past the feared enemy, and saw a man who had lost everything, just as she had. A widower and a widow. Two survivors from different worlds, marooned together on this tiny island of Earth. "No," she said, her voice firm. She pointed to the charcoal falcon he had drawn. "Chayton is here." Then she pointed to his head and his heart. "Here, and here. The leg is just a leg." A flicker of surprise, then something akin to gratitude showed in his eyes. He had been mourning the death of the warrior who could ride and fight. He had not yet seen the man who had survived. Alex's simple words were a seed of a new idea, that strength was not just in the body, but in the will to endure. That night something shifted in him. The next morning Alex found him by the creek, not hunting but watching. He was observing the flow of the water, the way the wind moved through the tall grass, the places where rocks offered cover. He was reading the land not as a hunter, but as a strategist. His mind, unable to rely on his body's speed, was becoming his primary weapon. He began teaching Samuel in earnest, not just how to track a deer, but how to read the signs of men, how to tell the difference between the tracks of a shod horse and an Indian pony, how to use the sun and stars to navigate. He was passing on a legacy not of warfare, but of awareness and survival. One afternoon, as Alex was mending a fence, Samuel came running from the creek, his face pale with excitement and fear. "Mama, Chayton found something." She followed him to a small, secluded part of the creek bank, hidden by willows. Chayton stood there, pointing. A thin, oily sheen coated the surface of the water, and several dead fish floated belly up. Downstream, a few of her cattle were refusing to drink. It wasn't a random act. It was poison. Clay Rock had returned. Unable to scare her off, he had resorted to a more insidious tactic, a slow, creeping death sentence for her livestock, and eventually for them. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Alex. This was her home. This was her son's future. She looked at Chayton. The haunted look was gone from his eyes. In its place was a cold, hard fire. This was not a cavalry ambush he couldn't control. This was an attack on his sanctuary, on the woman and boy who had saved him. He picked up his spear crutch, his knuckles white. He looked at the poisoned creek, then back toward the vast open land owned by Silas Kane. He didn't say a word, but his message was clear. The time for hiding was over. The time for hunting had begun. The poisoning of the creek was a declaration of war. Silas Kane and Clay Rock believed they were dealing with a helpless widow. They had no idea they had also targeted a man whose entire life had been a study in tactics and survival. Shaitan was no longer just a refugee. He was the defender of this small patch of land. He did not act with rage or haste. For 2 days he and Alex worked, hauling fresh water from a small spring he knew of further up in the hills, a place hidden from the main trail. It was backbreaking work, but it kept them and their animals alive. All the while, Chayton was observing, planning. His mind, sharpened by years of warfare on these very plains, was mapping out a response. He knew Rock's men would be back to check on their handiwork. They would be arrogant, careless. He chose his ground carefully, a narrow bend in the creek bed, flanked by a thicket of cottonwoods on one side and a steep, rocky bank on the other. It was a natural choke point. He explained his plan to Alex with drawings in the dirt, in sparse, direct English. He wasn't planning a slaughter. He was planning a lesson. "They think you are weak," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Today, they learn." Alex's role was simple but vital. She was to be the bait. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie, she took a bucket and walked toward the creek, making herself visible from the main trail. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands were steady. She had lived with fear for so long it had become a familiar companion. Hidden in the cottonwood thicket, Chayton waited. He was not armed with a rifle or a bow. He had his spear crutch and a long rope of braided rawhide. Samuel was safely hidden in the small cave they had used before, under strict instructions not to make a sound. Soon the sound of 2 riders approached. It was 2 of Cain's men, not Rock himself. They were laughing, joking about the stubborn widow. They saw Alex by the creek and reined in their horses. "Well, look what we have here," one of them called out, a sneer on his face. "Come to watch your cows die of thirst, Mrs. Finch." Alex stood her ground, her face a mask of defiance. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice carrying in the still evening air. "This will all be Cain's land soon enough," the other man said, dismounting. "Maybe we'll keep you on to cook and clean." He started walking toward her, his intentions menacingly clear. That was the signal. From the thicket, the rawhide rope shot out low to the ground. Chayton had tied one end to a sturdy tree trunk. The second man, still on his horse, saw it too late. His horse, moving at a walk, tripped on the rope, sending the rider tumbling hard to the ground with a cry of surprise and pain. The first man spun around, reaching for his pistol, but Chayton was already moving. He exploded from the trees, not with the speed of a runner, but with the terrifying, direct momentum of a falling boulder. His limp was pronounced, but he used it, planting his good leg and pivoting on the crutch with incredible force. Before the man could even clear his holster, the heavy, fire-hardened end of the crutch slammed into his gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. The man screamed and dropped his pistol. The second rider, dazed and winded, was struggling to his feet. Alex, acting on pure instinct, scooped up a heavy rock from the creek bed and threw it with all her might. It struck the man square in the back of the head. He grunted and collapsed, stunned. It was over in seconds. The 2 ranch hands were disarmed and incapacitated. Chayton stood over them, his chest heaving, a fierce light in his eyes. He looked every inch the Lakota warrior, a spirit of vengeance rising from the plains. He searched their saddlebags, finding a canteen of whiskey and a small bag of the poison they had used. The evidence. He used their own ropes to tie them up, binding them securely. He then looked at Alex, who stood frozen, the rock still heavy in her hand. A look of profound respect passed between them. She had not flinched. She had fought. "Now," Chayton said, his voice low and firm, "we send message." They loaded the 2 groaning men onto one horse and tied them to the saddle. On the second horse, they packed the poison and the men's guns. Chayton painted a single stark symbol on the horse's flank with mud, a falcon in flight. It was his signature. He slapped the horse's rump, sending it trotting back in the direction of the Kane Ranch. The other horse, with the men, he led a short distance before sending it off as well. They would be found. The message would be delivered. As they watched the horses disappear into the twilight, Alex finally let out a shaky breath. This was a point of no return. They had not just defended her land. They had counterattacked. They had struck a blow against Silas Kane. She looked at Chayton, who was now staring at his crippled leg, then back at the makeshift battlefield. He had won not with speed or agility, but with intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of his enemy's arrogance. He was beginning to see it himself. His strength had not vanished. It had merely changed its form. He had turned his weakness into a weapon, and the plains would soon learn the name of the crippled falcon. The horse bearing the falcon symbol arrived at the Kane Ranch like a proclamation. The story of what happened at Whispering Creek spread through the region like a prairie fire, mutating with every telling. In the saloons of redemption, the tale was of two of Silas Kane's best men being taken down by a ghost, a demon who moved without a sound and struck with the force of lightning. No one dared to say it was the widow. It was something more, something older and more frightening. Silas Kane was a man who prized control above all else. He was not a fool. He knew this wasn't the work of a lone woman. The story from his humiliated, injured men, combined with Rock's earlier suspicions and the symbol on the horse, painted a clear picture. The widow was harboring the escaped Lakota warrior. Instead of fear, Kane felt a surge of opportunity. He had been trying to paint Alex Finch as a stubborn, unstable woman. Now he could paint her as a traitor, an Indian lover, a threat to the entire community. He could turn her private war into a public crusade. He rode into redemption, not as a cattle baron, but as a concerned citizen. He bought a round of drinks at the saloon, his voice resonating with manufactured gravity. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice silencing the room. "We have a cancer in our midst. We've all lost friends, family to the savages who would see us driven out." He paused, letting the murmurs of agreement ripple through the crowd. "I tried to help the widow Finch," he continued, his tone full of false pity. "I offered her a fair price, a chance to live here in town under our protection. She refused. We thought it was grief, stubbornness. We were wrong." He slammed his fist on the bar. "She is sheltering the very animal who helped slaughter our soldiers at Red Shale Bluffs, the one who escaped. She has chosen to side with him against her own kind. That poison in her creek? It wasn't my men. It was him. A savage's trick to make us look bad." The lie was audacious but effective. Fear is a far more potent force than truth. Men who had privately admired Alex's grit now looked at each other with suspicion. The whispers that had once followed her now turned into angry accusations. Clay Rock stepped forward. "He attacked my men, broke Cobb's hand, nearly caved in Miller's skull. It ain't just a rumor, it's a fact." Sheriff Brody, who had been nursing a beer in the corner, looked cornered. All eyes turned to him. His authority was a flimsy shield against the tidal wave of Kane's influence. "Now, Silas, we don't know for sure," Brody started weakly. "What's not to know, Sheriff?" Kane thundered. "Are you going to enforce the law? Or are you going to wait until that savage and his whore are picking off our children one by one?" The ugly words hung in the air. The choice was made. Brody, his face pale and sweating, knew he had to act. To refuse would be to lose his badge, and likely his life. "All right," Brody conceded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll form a posse. We'll ride out at dawn. We'll bring them in." "Bring them in," Rock scoffed. "We're going out there to exterminate a problem, Sheriff. Justice has to be done." The mood in the saloon turned dark and ugly. Men who were simple farmers and shopkeepers an hour before were now filled with a righteous, bloodthirsty fury. They were no longer a community. They were a mob. Miles away at the homestead, an uneasy quiet had settled. Chayton knew they had only bought themselves a little time. He spent the days fortifying their position. He showed Alex how to reinforce the cabin door and window shutters. He dug a shallow trench behind a rocky outcrop, a perfect position to fire from without being an easy target. He was preparing for a siege. He also did something else. He found the tallest hill overlooking the creek and built a small, deliberate pile of stones. In the center, he placed a single perfect falcon feather he had kept hidden in his medicine pouch. It was a sign, a prayer, a message to the spirits or to any one of his people who might pass through this land. It was an act of faith in a world that had given him little reason to have any. One evening, he approached Alex as she cleaned the shotgun, its metallic scent filling the air. "They will come," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," she replied, not looking up. "Many, angry." He looked toward the horizon, then back at her and Samuel, who was sleeping. "You and the boy should go. I will lead them away to the north." He was offering her an escape. He was willing to sacrifice himself to be the bait that would save her and her son. A year ago, she might have taken it. She would have run, terrified, to protect Samuel. But she was not the same woman. This land, this cabin, was no longer just a place of grief and hardship. It was a home she had fought for. And the man standing before her was no longer a feared enemy. He was her partner, her protector, her friend. "No," she said, finally meeting his gaze, her own eyes as hard and clear as prairie agate. "Thomas built this home. I buried him on that hill. This is my land. They are not taking it." She looked at Chayton, a fierce loyalty burning in her eyes. "This is our home. We stand here together." A slow, rare smile touched Chayton's lips. In her defiance, he saw the same unbreakable spirit that had kept his own people fighting for generations. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect and acceptance. The die was cast. The fury of redemption was gathering, and the small homestead by Whispering Creek was about to become the epicenter of a storm of blood and fire. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sky the color of old iron. The posse from Redemption, nearly 20 men strong, rode with a grim purpose. They were a mix of Kane's hardened ranch hands, led by a vengeful Clay Rock, and townsfolk armed with old hunting rifles in a mob's righteous certainty. Sheriff Brody rode at the front, his face a mask of miserable reluctance. He was a puppet, and Silas Kane was pulling the strings. At the homestead there was no panic, only a taut, electric readiness. Chayton had positioned Alex in the shallow trench he dug behind the rocks. It gave her a clear line of sight to the front of the cabin and the trail while offering excellent cover. Samuel was hidden in the root cellar beneath the cabin floor, with strict orders to stay there no matter what he heard. Chayton himself was not in one place. He was a ghost, a shadow. His plan was not to meet them head-on, but to bleed them, to confuse them, to use their numbers against them. His crippled leg, a liability in an open fight, became an asset in this terrain he now knew better than his own skin. It forced him to be smarter, quieter, more deliberate. The posse thundered into the clearing, their horses churning the soft earth. They saw the cabin, seemingly quiet and deserted. "Finch, you and the savage in there? Come on out with your hands high!" Brody yelled, his voice cracking. There was no answer but the sigh of the wind. Rock laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "They've flown the coop, Sheriff, or they're too scared to show their faces." He turned to his men. "Cobb, Miller, you circle around the back. Rest of you spread out. I want that scalp and the widow in my bed by noon." As Cobb and Miller spurred their horses toward the back of the cabin, a single shot rang out, not from the cabin, but from the rocky outcrop. Alex, her cheek pressed firmly against the stock of the shotgun, had fired. She hadn't aimed for the men, but for the dirt in front of their horses. The animals screamed and reared, throwing both riders to the ground. The posse erupted into a chaotic volley of fire, riddling the cabin walls and the rocks with bullets. It was exactly what Chayton had anticipated. They were shooting blindly, wasting ammunition. While their attention was focused on the cabin and Alex's position, Chayton made his move. He emerged silently from the dense willows along the creek bed, a place they had overlooked. He was on the posse's flank. He didn't have a gun. He had something far more demoralizing, a single, perfectly aimed rock. It struck the town baker, a large man named Peterson, squarely in the temple. The man dropped his rifle and collapsed without a sound. Another man near him spun around. Where did that come from? Before anyone could react, Chayton had vanished back into the willows. Panic began to set in. They were being attacked from two directions by an enemy they couldn't see. Rock, furious, tried to regain control. "He's in the creek. Flush him out." Two of Kane's men charged toward the creek bed, firing their pistols wildly into the trees. This was another of Chayton's traps. He had dug a pit, covered with a thin layer of branches and leaves. The lead rider's horse went down with a sickening crack of its leg. The man was pinned, screaming. The second rider reined in hard, his face a mask of terror. This wasn't a fight. It was a haunting. From her position, Alex fired again, this time taking out the hat of a man trying to get a clear shot at the creek. Her shots were deliberate, designed to intimidate, not to kill. She was a mother defending her home, not a murderer. The fight devolved into a tense standoff. The posse, now dismounted and taking cover, was spooked. They had come expecting to overwhelm a lone woman and a wounded Indian. Instead, they were being dismantled with chilling efficiency. Chayton moved like a spirit of the land, his limp a strange rhythmic beat in the symphony of chaos he was conducting. He would appear, strike with his spear crutch or a well-aimed rock, and disappear before they could draw a bead on him. He disabled 3 more men without taking a single bullet himself, one with a dislocated shoulder, another with a broken ankle from a fall into a hidden hole. Rock, his face purple with rage, finally spotted him. Chayton was moving between 2 boulders, and for a split second, his silhouette was clear. Rock raised his rifle, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Got you, you cripple!" he roared. But as he fired, another shot rang out, this one from much closer. It wasn't Alex. Sheriff Brody, who had been huddled behind a wagon, had finally made a choice. His bullet kicked up the dirt right at Rock's feet, making him flinch and spoil his aim. "That's enough, Rock," Brody shouted, his voice finally finding its strength. "This is a massacre. We came to make an arrest, not to slaughter people." "Get out of my way, you yellow-bellied coward," Rock snarled, turning his rifle on the sheriff. It was in that moment of distraction that Chayton saw his opening. Ignoring the searing pain in his leg, he charged from cover, moving with that same terrifying, unstoppable momentum he'd used before. He wasn't aiming for Rock. He was aiming for Silas Kane, who had been watching the entire battle from a safe distance on his fine black stallion, like a king observing a tournament. Kane saw the crippled warrior coming for him, his face a mask of primal fury. And for the first time in his life, the powerful cattle baron felt the icy grip of real fear. He fumbled for his pistol, but he was a businessman, not a gunman. He never got the chance to fire. A sudden, thunderous sound rolled across the plains, drowning out the gunfire. It was the sound of dozens of galloping horses. Over the rise, a line of riders appeared, their silhouettes stark against the gray sky. It wasn't the cavalry, it was Lakota, a full war party, their faces painted, their lances held high. They had seen the sign, the pile of stones, the falcon feather. They had found their lost brother. The posse froze. Rock, Brody, Kane. Everyone stared in stunned disbelief. The tables had not just been turned. The entire game had been swept from the board. The war party was led by a stern, powerful warrior who reined in his horse. His eyes scanned the scene. The besieged cabin, the disabled posse members, the defiant widow behind the rocks, and Chayton, the crippled warrior, standing alone in the middle of the field, holding the most powerful man in the territory at bay. The lead warrior looked at Chayton, at his shattered leg, and then at the tactical chaos he had wrought upon a force that outnumbered him 20-1. A look of awe, of profound respect dawned on his face. Chayton stood his ground, his spear crutch planted firmly in the earth. He was not just a survivor, he was a commander. He was a leader. He had held the line. He looked at the war party, his people, and then back at Alex, his partner in the fight. He had found his home, and now his family had come to help him defend it. The siege of Whispering Creek was over. The legend of Chayton, the falcon who walks, was about to begin. In the aftermath, Silas Kane's empire of fear crumbled. Faced with a band of Lakota warriors who had witnessed his treachery firsthand, and with Sheriff Brody finally finding the courage to speak the truth, Kane's power in redemption evaporated. He and Rock were driven from the territory, their names becoming a curse on the wind. The Lakota did not seek vengeance. They saw something far more valuable than blood. They saw in Chayton a new kind of strength. His body was broken, but his mind was sharper than any blade. He had defeated a superior force not with brute strength, but with strategy, courage, and an unbreakable will. He had forged an alliance with a white woman, proving he could see beyond the hatred that divided their worlds. The war chief, a man named Sitting Bear, looked at Chayton and saw the future of his people, a leader who could think, adapt, and fight with his wits when his legs could no longer carry him into battle. Chayton did not leave with them immediately. He stayed until he was sure Alex and Samuel were safe, their deed to the land secured and respected. The bond between the widow and the warrior was deeper than words, a partnership forged in fire and sealed with mutual respect. It was never a romance in the way the townsfolk would whisper about for years. It was something stronger, a meeting of two souls who had found in each other the courage to rebuild their shattered lives. When he finally did ride out, it was not as a follower, but as an advisor, a tactician sitting tall in a specially crafted saddle. He became known across the plains not as Chayton the Cripple, but as Chayton Mapia, the Falcon of the Sky, a leader who united scattered bands of his people, negotiating peace when possible and masterminding brilliant defenses when necessary. He taught them that survival was not just about fighting, but about outthinking your enemy. Alex Finch remained at Whispering Creek, a respected, formidable figure in her own right. She was the woman who had faced down Silas Kane and sheltered a legend. Her son Samuel grew up with a foot in two worlds, speaking English and Lakota, understanding the ways of the homesteader and the heart of the warrior. He was a bridge, a living testament to the day a knock on the door during a violent storm didn't bring death, but instead gave birth to an unlikely hero of the plains. The story of Alex Finch and Chayton is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about a perfect body or a powerful army, but about the resilience of the human spirit. It shows us that heroes are often found in the most desperate of circumstances, and that leadership is forged not in glory, but in the fires of adversity. It's about how one act of compassion, one moment of courage, can change the course of history in ways no one could ever predict. If this story of courage, survival, and the birth of a legend moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a true tale of the Wild West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring the forgotten heroes of the past back to life. Your support allows us to keep these incredible histories from fading into dust.